Hello, BookTube. I'm revisiting week one again for New Worlds November, which was the theme was terrestrial. Now I've been doing a few videos to try to catch up on the reading that I did in week one. Now I read five novels, short novels, and a number of other short stories. Now this video, I'm going to talk about it's a bit of not necessarily first contact, but that is part of this. It's more communications, how to communicate with the aliens, and by no means I am doing a overall thing in science fiction. All I'm going to do is talk about the books that I read and compare them with maybe a little bit of how a lot of science fiction writers deal with this, but that's not going to be the thrust of it. It's going to be based on the stories that I read. Now, I had already the first book I read. I already did a video for this for Childhood's End. Now it's First Contact, and aliens come to Earth, and it seems to be very, very easy. The aliens learn English basically. That's the kind of thing that happens in a lot of science fiction. It's a very easy thing. That it's not complicated. It's not. It might say it's complicated, but there's no details usually, and there's no details in here. It just sort of happens, and then they're able to communicate. The next one was it was two books, but it's Needle by Hal Clement. And this again was First Contact, and it's a virus, a parasitical sort of creature living in symbiosis as a symbiote inside another biological being. And in this case, this hunter or policeman is chasing a fugitive of his own species for chasing him because he committed murder. Now his host dies when his ship crashes into the ocean off of a tiny island in the South Pacific. So he has to find a new host. He first goes into a shark, which it wasn't good enough, so it died. But then he goes into a 15-year-old boy named Bob, and he has to try to first learn the biology and everything and how this human works, and then he discovers a way to communicate with him. So with he makes words appear in space through his eyes so he can see and he can talk that way. Later on for the next one, he's able to talk, like actually make sounds in the ear, sort of manipulating the eardrum to make a sound so he can talk. And then he learns English. The alien learns English again. He's learned English, and he understands Bob and everybody else is talking because he can hear everybody else around him. So again, that's it's for, but again, these that kind of thing isn't really the thrust of the story. It's incidental because it needs to be done, but yeah, it's just there. Now, the other one I read was The Goblin Reservation by Clifford D. Simak. Now, everybody already has like all the aliens that are in here, plus the fae or the little people, the goblins, trolls, fairies, banshee, all can communicate with humans and all in an English language. There is a first contact, potentially a first contact, with another very old alien race, but they are somehow able to talk to the human as well. It's not that is not the thrust of the story. It just incidentally they have to communicate, so therefore they are communicating, and that happens a lot in science fiction for writers because it's not the thrust of the story. It's just it has to be dealt with, but it's or not dealt with at all. It just happens. They're able to understand each other. Um, now we get into two, or actually, there's one other because I'm going to go into the second week as well because we're past this. Robert Silverberg's Across the Billion Years. Now, there is a first contact ish type there as well, but it's inhabited in a late 24th century, a universe where humans and aliens live together sort of peacefully, and they in this case they're on an archaeological expedition and they decide this the language, the lingua franca of the expedition is angelic, sort of English, but it's sort of a modern English of the time, or at least what humans speak. So everybody else conforms to that. However, some of them, there is obviously the other species have different languages. And then when they meet this robot, which was from the High Ones, a very old race in the universe, it has a completely different language, and the robot has to learn again English or Anglic, and he does it by a machine that records the language, then he records it as well, like just normal speech, so it gets enough of a pattern to this, and then he begins to speak English to everybody else. So that's how it's done in here. Very similar to the other ones, but that's not the reason for the story. Now we go to one that does have the reason for the story. We've got Ted Chiang with the story of your life, which is a first contact again with aliens that are very alien in how they speak, and their language, their written language, their thinking language is absolutely different from humans. Now, Ted Chiang goes into a lot of detail with linguistic and philosophical descriptions on how the humans figure out the language. So it's, in this case, humans are figuring out the language, but also the aliens have figured it out too. But it's a very detailed account of linguistics and how thought patterns can be very different between species, because humans think in a linear pattern and these aliens think of, the future, past, and everything is all thought of at once. And the written language, it's sort of, before you even start, where it's ending, and it's all part of this structure. And he goes into a lot of detail to do this, and it's very fascinating, extremely fascinating. But in this case, I think it hurt the storytelling because it's so technical. It's fabulous in a different thing, but this it becomes very technical. And so, yeah, as I say, I think it hurts the storyline, and that can be an issue why a lot of writers don't do this, because ones that do try to make aliens think differently, it hampers the story, the plot, a lot of times, and it's very difficult to do this. But he attempted, and he did a very good job with it, I think. And then the last one I want to show is the sort of an intermediary between those two, is Hal Clement with Impediment, where again, first contact, aliens sort of come to Earth for help, and they're in Alaska. They meet a human, and they're called Mothmen. They look like moths. They think differently, but they telepathically get in touch with a human, and after months, they get the pattern of this human to understand, and there is a dialogue between them, but it's still not fully understood. It's not a clear communication line, and it only works with that one human, because they learned his brain patterns, so they can't speak to anybody else. That way, they have to start from scratch than to learn the brain patterns and the thoughts and everything like that. So it's just a fascinating thing of how do you deal with language. And the other one that I read was it had no aliens in it. It was Flesh by Philip Jose Farmer, and it's set in the future where not alien, sorry, humans have been in cryogenic sleep, exploring other parts of the galaxy. They come back hundreds and hundreds of years, about 800 years later, I think it is, and they come back to a society where they have to relearn the language as well. So it is another language. They learn the current lingua franca on Earth. So there is a language thing there, but it's not aliens. But also too, he does show, and that's the one thing that even within humans, there are different thought patterns with different languages. And it can structure this, help structure the society. See, the aliens, the pseudo, what are they called? The heptapods in Ted Chiang's story, their language, their way of thinking defines them as a species to a certain extent. And also the way humans think in a linear fashion defines them as a species because they get born, live, and die. But then once you start living, like, looking at it at the language in a different way, it can change society, it can change the thought patterns of the person. And that's dealt with in a few things, and that's like, Flesh touched on that. But that's another thing about learning the language, and the different things it's the language can determine a lot about the sociological structure, the religious strata, like all these strata of things of this being or beings or humans even, as in with Flesh. It's just an interesting thing, and it's in a lot of science fiction because aliens is a huge thing, but most of the time it's taken for granted that they've got, like in Star Trek, a universal translator, and boom, 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 it's all done. How does this all work? How is the thinking patterns of each of these species? How does that affect their lives, and how does it affect each other's lives? That is an interesting thing to delve into. That's different storylines in and of itself. And Ted Chiang just, delved into how do you go about, what are the nuts and bolts of trying to understand an alien language, not just a foreign language for humans, like that human can't speak. And that's difficult enough at times, but something alien, truly alien. And and then once that's done, can that change the perceptions of the person who's learned it? And in the case of, aliens, would that change the perception and how the aliens think? And that's slightly touched on with Hal Clement's impediment with the aliens, by learning the thought pattern, or the one alien learning the thought pattern of the human. But yeah, have you read any stories that deal with language, and how was that done? How was the communication done? Did it have any of these repercussions, or was it just taken for granted that in the story, these alien species and humans all speak together, and it's not an issue because that's not the thrust of the story? And I would say that's probably a large portion of science fiction that deals with aliens. That's just a guess, but it's I think it's pretty accurate to say that. But anyway, that's it. I'll end it there for this one. And thank you, BookTube. I'll see you next time. I think I still have a video or two possibly to make with week one. Thank you.